And today we're going to be talking with Mark Taylor-Canfield, who has been a freelance and independent journalist and working with a lot of different independent blogs on accurate coverage of the Occupy movement and really the relating his activism along with journalism. So I wanted to have him on today to share some of his experiences and really tie into a lot of the things we've been talking about on the Occupy the Press series. Mark, you there?
Sorry about that. You there, Mark?
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yep, sorry about that. That's my fault.
Okay, so I'm going to start by using a speakerphone, so if you do have audio difficulties, let me know, all right? I'll try to stay as close to the mouthpiece as possible.
Sounds good. You sound good right now.
Sounds good for now.
Yeah, that's because I'm speaking really close, but I'm probably going to move away as I speak and look at my notes here. But I think, this is a unique Skillshare presentation because what I'm actually sharing are my experiences as a journalist and activist, in order to answer the following questions, which is, how do we as occupiers deal with the media? And how do we create our own media? And so these are the issues that I deal with pretty much every day. And I wanted to offer some insights into what it's like to be a journalist so folks in the Occupy movement can better understand how reporters think and what motivates them on a daily basis and why perhaps they do or do not react to requests to cover the Occupy movement or its events. And I especially wanted to show people how they can create their own media as a way to circumvent the corporate resistance to this movement. And I certainly don't speak for everyone in the movement, but these are my own personal individual experiences. So the first thing that I noticed today, I'm just going to throw this in really quick, is that this story about the UN envoys criticizing the United States and sending a letter to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton about the crackdowns on occupiers by police in this country, I think is very significant, and it's something that folks have been fighting for in terms of international scrutiny and recognition of these issues since the WTO demonstrations way back in 1999. So I wanted to bring that to people's attention. Oh, great, and now my computer, of course, as I'm speaking. Okay, and the other thing I wanted to mention too really quick is that since we're talking about alternative media today, it's really, really important that people realize that Free Speech Radio News is now facing a major financial crisis. And I've been reporting for them for years. And in case you don't know, the program was a result of the Berkeley Free Speech movement. And the Pacifica Radio Network was a public radio network long before NPR was ever created. So over the years and recently, folks like Amy Goodman and Howard Zinn had spoken out in support of FSRN as one of the only last independent voices left in the U.S. media. So I served on the Free Speech Radio News Steering Committee and also reported for them for many years. And I just wanted to make a quick pitch to anybody who's interested in alternative media, because it's the only news program I know of that's run by reporters and not controlled by some elite management team or board of directors. And the reporters are paid by a foundation that they themselves created called Pacifica Reporters for Free Speech. And they did that because they wanted to be independent from the Pacifica Radio Network. And so all of our editorial decisions and content is not controlled by the network. It's controlled by the reporters themselves. And the result has been a long list of cutting-edge news reports from many really nearly inaccessible places around the world, and a lot of stories that wouldn't normally be covered you can hear every day on Free Speech Radio News around the country and a bunch of community and college radio stations. So, basically I wanted to say that if we want as activists to counter the corporate media, we better support the alternative media. And I haven't seen many efforts amongst the occupiers to really help support, raise money, and spread even by word of mouth a lot of these alternative media outlets that need their support. I was the only reporter in the country to file a story on the Occupy Solidarity Social Forum, which took place in Washington State at the state capitol of Olympia earlier this year. And Free Speech Radio News was the only place in the country where you could hear interviews with participants at that event, which included folks from all over the country, from the original Occupy Wall Street folks in New York City, to people up and down the country, from Florida, from Montana, San Diego. They were there, but no corporate media covered it, and actually no alternative media covered it. But Free Speech Radio News was the only place in the country that stepped up and said, hey, we think this is an important story for the history of the country and this movement, so we want this information. So the situation right now is that they only have enough money to last through the end of the month. So if it's going to survive, it's got to be supported by activists. And there needs to be some kind of national campaign to promote and support truly independent media. If we're going to counter the corporate media, we've got to support our own. And it's got to be done now, because as we speak, a lot of small community public radio stations are going off the air, and a lot of alternative media groups like FSRN are really suffering financially. So I hope the Occupy movement understands this, and believe me, I know, I've met Amy Goodman, and she's not going to be able to carry the entire weight of the movement on her back. There's got to be other reliable sources of real, authentic news, and Free Speech Radio News is one of those places. So these people are totally dedicated activist journalists, and you're not going to find that anywhere or very often. And so that's my pitch for that. I just wanted to let everybody know this is kind of an alert to the movement about what's going on there. But to let you know a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from, I'll give you a quick little background. I've done both news reporting and media jamming. And at this point, my bio is pretty extensive, but here's a few things that have happened. First of all, despite, my recent success as a journalist, I have always and will always be committed to grassroots independent journalism. That's where I came from. That's where my loyalty is. It's to the people on the streets, not with the power brokers in the media. And there have been a few unsuccessful drives, to co-opt my skills, let's put it that way, by folks in the media. But I feel I can best serve this whole movement by trying to contribute my skills as a writer and commentator on the Occupy Wall Street movement. And as far as I've been involved with Free Speech Radio News for years. A Pacifica Radio Network affiliate station here outside of Seattle is KBCS, and we created a syndicated news program there called One World Report, and our theme was Local Meets Global, and that broadcast is now on a network of public and community stations on the West Coast. So I was in on a group of activists and volunteers at the time who decided to help KBCS create a news department. I'm also a member of Occupy Seattle's media working group, and I've been an occupier since last October. Since that time, I've also been contributing as a writer for the Huffington Post, writing about the Occupy movement, and my articles are also being published by Alexander Coburn and Jeffrey St. Clair for their magazine Counterpunch. And recently, the Seattle Times published my op-ed piece on these global austerity measures on the Occupy Wall Street movement. So I've been really busy lately trying to keep up with the movement and do as much as I can to get the word out and kind of break through some of these corporate news barriers. So through Alternet, Crosscut, the Independent Media Center, and all sorts of other folks, I've been continuing to try to keep people updated on the movement and what's happening. Also, I've been quoted numerous times by the Associated Press and Reuters and CBS News and all the rest of these people. Part of that happened because at a particular protest here in Seattle, I decided to just do this individual act and burn my Bank of America card. And that was right at the time when they were introducing these new fees, so it was a big topic in the media. And the photo of me burning my Bank of America card went all around the world and ended up on CBS News and the Washington Post and all over the place. So since then, I've been really busy trying to speak out about what's happening in the movement and try to clarify what's really going on instead of giving into a lot of the corporate media spin. And some of the places that I've been able to do that are on Free Speech TV, on Tom Hartman's show. I'm a regular weekly guest there, and I also do the Norman Goldwyn show and Mike Malloy's national radio programs. I've also been on the air with Dr. Cornel West, David Sirota, Brad Friedman, Amy Goodman, a lot of other really interesting people. And I have stirred up some controversy with my blog at Daily Coast because I tend to be very critical of the electoral system, and the Democrats and people on that website don't like that, which is one thing that happens if you're an alternative media journalist. I don't think that's a bad thing. If what you're writing or reporting is causing anger and debate, I actually consider that a good thing. That you're actually stirring things up. And that goes back to...
That leads into the responsibility of journalists to try to tell the truth. And if we could just kind of move into, what you feel the job of a journalist is, and then kind of the relation and impact that journalism has, you feel journalism can have on activism.
Well, to me, it goes down to what is the question of really what is a journalist. And, I mean, there are different times when different things are appropriate. Like, I've done some pranks with the Yes Men, but that was not necessarily as a journalist. I think journalists, really, their job is to challenge authority. And I think this is a really important issue that's kind of been lost in the United States, because what is a reporter? And, my answer to that is that the job of a good reporter is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Because we as reporters have an absolute responsibility to tell the truth and to always protect our sources. And there's some really good examples of the mistakes that people have made by not following those tenets. One really, really bad example was William Randolph Hearst, who used his whole chain of newspapers to drum up support for a war with Spain. And it didn't matter if the stories that they were printing about Spanish atrocities in Cuba were true, as long as the reports furthered his cause to bring the U.S. into war and build a global American empire. There's some corollaries there if you look at what's happening with Fox and their news organization. An example of false information that caused the deaths of a lot of people and serious unrest and chaos was the Boxer Rebellion in China, which actually started, it was the result of a fabricated news story about U.S. plans to tear down the Great Wall of China, which had never been planned, but it basically caused a rebellion, and pretty soon American embassies were being burned. I believe in activist journalism, and I've asked actually Amy Goodman and Ralph Nader about this issue. Amy Goodman told me there is no such thing as an unbiased journalist. And I agree with her that in the alternative media, folks tend to choose or show their bias by what they cover, but not how they cover it. And then Nader just said, remember which hat you're wearing at what time, which is true. You can't really report on an event that you're a part of. I mean, there's a conflict of interest there to actually interview yourself about an event that you organized. You know what I'm saying? So reporters should, however, in my opinion, be activists and muckrakers and iconoclasts. And speaking truth to power is our obligation and it's our duty to society. And if you want to look at the result of the failure of the fourth estate, where there's no accountability for those in power and government and corporations and large institutions, well, just look at the United States today. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was corporate media consolidation, because that has had a huge effect on what's happened to American media. And basically, FCC Chairman Michael Powell was in a battle with two of his commissioners, Copps and Adelstein, who were on our side and said that corporate media consolidation is really bad for the news. But corporations like Fox and others claimed that they had more resources, so therefore they could do more local news coverage. And actually, the result of all the research is that less local community news coverage happens when the media is consolidated that way and corporations own all of the outlets. And one of the things that happened was that I uncovered two suppressed research reports that the FCC itself had commissioned, which contradicted their arguments that allowing for corporate media consolidation equaled more local news coverage. And that was groundbreaking work with Free Speech Radio News. And we got two whistleblowers. One of them, there was Professor Napoli and Professor Janich from the University of Delaware, who came out saying that, yes, they were commissioned to do these reports, and the results were suppressed. And the FCC even denied they had these reports because they showed that local news coverage would suffer. So does the corporate media really care about reporting the community news, and do they really care about the Occupy Wall Street movement? The answer is no, they don't. There might be a few sympathetic reporters out there in the corporate media, but they're usually muffled by their editors at some point. And we've seen what happens to people like Greg Palast, even Dan Rather, and other numerous examples of reporters who've been vilified for taking on the status quo. So most, well-known and famous journalists are more interested in rubbing elbows with power and getting an invitation to the White House than they are doing any kind of serious investigative journalism. There is very little investigative journalism left in the United States, and most of the corporations, the corporate news outlets now rely on unpaid or low-paid bloggers to get a lot of their information. They take advantage of social sourcing all the time because their whole intent is to get news that they don't have to pay anyone for. Their corporate news staffs have been cut to the bone. There aren't as many reporters assigned to stories anymore. People in news agencies are always overworked and usually underpaid. So given the sad state of corporate journalism, how can we as Occupy activists and media groups deal with them? Well, my response to that is the key is to help them do their job. And what I mean by that is this is based on my experience in the School of Hard Knocks, is that this is how you can get reporters to respond to events that you're putting on or things that are happening in the news that they want to talk to you about. So basically, you have to remember that they have daily deadlines. Their deadlines may be in a couple hours. They have an editor breathing down their neck saying, you've got to get this story out. They don't have time to wait for information. So if you don't get them the information, it will not be included in their article, and your point of view may not even be included. And you may not be able to counter misinformation that's going out. So be prompt and always return their calls and emails and requests for information immediately, because remember that they're working on a really quick deadline. And many times the reporter he's only got a few hours. He or she only has a few hours to complete the story for broadcast or publication, so they're really stressed. And by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, as far as most news agencies are concerned, the story's over and done and it's old news. And they just want to go home and get away from it all. So if the story breaks late in the day, you may not get a call at all from a reporter until very early the next morning. And despite the unpredictable nature of breaking news events, most folks who work in the media still stick to a regular schedule, although they might be there at 5 a.m. to start reporting on the morning news. And so media groups have to be willing to take calls or give interviews at the crack of dawn sometimes in order to accommodate the morning news shows. Because if you wait until later in the day, the editors might lose interest in the story and decide not to cover it. There might be a car wreck or something that takes, precedent in the news. In other words, you have to be willing to work on their schedule, even if it's not your schedule and you end up getting very little sleep for days at a time. But you just have to remind yourself when you get tired that news cycles eventually end, and most of the time that phone is going to remain silent until some expected event comes along or some major activist event is being planned. And so a lot of what people have to do in these media groups is actually be journalists themselves and be their own reporters and researchers so they can stay on top of the story so that the reporters have the information they're looking for. They have to develop excellent sources that the reporters don't have, like folks in the activist community. They have to offer reporters people that they can interview and quote at a moment's notice. If you do that, they'll love you because that's hard for them to track people down. And if no one's immediately available for that interview, then as a media person on the media group, you can offer yourself as a spokesperson, clarifying that you don't speak for everyone associated with the movement. But if you don't have the information that they're requesting, or you can't confirm what the reporter's telling you about your own group or your event, then don't respond. Politely excuse yourself and get confirmation from reliable sources before you reply to them. And just tell them that you'll call them back when you can get more information. And then if you can't find the information that they requested and no one has any idea what the reporter's talking about, then it's perfectly okay not to call them back because they may have the wrong information or be on the wrong story. And they'll understand that if you don't confirm what they're saying, then they can't really report it. And they'll also understand that you don't want to be misquoted or you don't want to appear ignorant or uninformed. there was an excellent skills share on press releases, so I won't cover that. But basically, if it's well done, reporters will gladly plagiarize your press release and put steal complete paragraphs and put it in their article, which is fine. That's good. That means that you get your message across and you get them to write their story, help them write their story, and they'll probably call you back. So one of the main issues that we have in the alternative media and in the Occupy movement is freedom of the press and this expanding definition of what the word journalism means and what it is. So I would say that in the Occupy movement, there are actually embedded journalists, and what they are is alternative media reporters or people who are activists who are citizen journalists. And they are very important partners in the movement, and they are definitely a part of the movement. So even though alternative media is suffering from lack of funding and promotion, it's a very, very vital part of the movement. And people have to remember that public TV and radio fund drives are way down since 2008, and so is public funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. A lot of that is due to Republican political gains in the U.S. Congress, but public and community-based stations won't accept corporate funding. So in effect, they remain very independent, but they're also very poor. And the Republicans' attempts to shut down the Corporation for Public Broadcasting actually isn't really affecting NPR because they have plenty of sources, including corporate sources, for funding. Yes, they do have commercials. But the problem is that small public and community radio stations and alternative media is losing up to 75% of their funding through the CPB. And so they're the real losers in that situation. And the sad thing is, and this has to do with media consolidation as well, is if you're in a small rural area in Washington State, hundreds of miles from Seattle, you can't get any local community news. You can only get news from Seattle or Portland. That's the way the corporate media works, and it's really a shame because no one is going to be reporting on your community at that point, and that's what's happening around the country. I don't think the corporations are worried about that at all, but we should be. Some good examples of people who have been able to create alternative media was the Seattle Independent Media Center that was set up here in 1999, and it was specifically set up to provide on-the-street coverage of the WTO demonstrations as a counter to the corporate reporting. And during that, we had a lot of the same issues that people are having now in the Occupy movement with, the use of so-called less lethal weaponry, mass violations of people's civil rights. And as a result of that, I was a founding member of a group called the Committee for Local Government Accountability, and we sent our report on civil rights violations to the Center on Constitutional Rights. And basically what it covered was police activity and mass violations of freedom of the press and freedom of speech and assembly in Seattle. So a lot of those issues were happening way back then, and it sparked this need for alternative media. So everyone knows, I guess, that the Independent Media Center then kind of spread around the world, and now you can find hundreds of IMC websites. Much like today, the city investigations and even our reports failed to make a dent in the corporate media coverage. It was all about broken windows. So that was a great example of how, and I was on a project that news clipped everything we could find that was reported about the WTO demonstrations. And believe me, the corporate media, even the world media, really focused mostly on a few small issues about broken windows. It didn't really talk about any of the larger issues involved, which is the situation that people in the Occupy Wall Street movement seem to have all of the time. So our only response is to be our own media and be our own news agency. There's many ways that people can do that. Before I get to that, which is most of what I had to say today, then I just want to let people know that, when the live streamers Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski were raided at gunpoint by police in Chicago during the NATO summit protest, that was an alarm bell ringing that we really, really need to pay attention to the rights of citizen journalists and all journalists. My federal civil rights class action lawsuit was filed earlier this year against the state of Washington and the Washington State Patrol, and it resulted from my illegal detainment and banishment from Washington State property at the state capitol, including the state capitol building. I was there as a reporter at the time wearing my press badge, and I was covering a sit-in in the state capitol rotunda. What happened was that they carried me, they told me to leave. I wouldn't leave, especially since there were other corporate reporters around leaving, although they seemed to be very intimidated as well and tried to move away from the police. I basically was dragged out of the Capitol Rotunda by 4 Washington State Patrol officers. I was put up against a wall somewhere in the back of the building, photographed, told to sign a piece of paper, which was what equals, what basically comes down to a no trespass order. This is not the first time this has happened to me, but they told me to sign the paper. I told them that I refused to sign anything without legal counsel. The Washington State Patrol trooper then signed it himself, and then I was released. However, I was handed a copy of that piece of paper which said that I was now banned from any state property, and that if I set foot in any, and unfortunately even the 2 major parks in downtown Olympia are owned by the state, they're not city parks. So if I had gone to any place where there are any protests going on, I would have been arrested for criminal trespass. There were other people who were also given these no trespass orders, and this is also something that's happened in other parts of the country, although they call them different things. But they're just basically a way of not having to process people through the courts and not having to arrest them, but keeping them from going to any more protests and stopping them from protesting that day. That's what mass arrests are about, and that's a lot of what the use of less lethal weaponry and tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets is about, is stopping the protest without having to actually arrest, jail, and process people. So in this case, I filed a lawsuit. U.S. District Court Judge Robert J. Bryan ruled that it was a violation of the First Amendment and in my case, especially freedom of the press. So he called a temporary restraining order and then a full injunction, and then forced the Washington State Patrol to forever stop illegally detaining people and giving them so-called no trespass orders, because it's also lack of due process, because none of us were ever allowed to go before a judge or jury, and we were never charged with anything, yet we were being punished, which is an issue that the Occupy Wall Street movement has with police agencies around the country, is that they seem to forget that their job is not to punish the protesters. That is the job of the courts to decide whether they deserve punishment. In my case, the judge decided that no crime had been committed except by the Washington State Patrol. So we were very happy to see that happen. As a result of my case, 36 other people had their criminal trespass charges dropped, because they subsequently challenged those no trespass orders by going back to a protest and then were arrested. So freedom of the press is really, really important. And the only thing I can say about that is that I'm not an attorney, but the National Lawyers Guild and the American Civil Liberties Union has a lot of information regarding issues. And the one thing that you should remember is that, no, you don't need accreditation and you don't need an official press pass from the Society of Professional Journalists to be a reporter and to be protected under the First Amendment. You have the right to be there to live stream, to videotape, and to present yourself as a journalist while you're covering these events. And you know that your job is very important, and the other activists know that your job is really important, and people all over the world who are watching need your media, and they know it's important. So don't worry about that. It doesn't mean that you won't be arrested. Obviously, during a private function, like a conference run by a corporation, they do have the right to ban reporters. I was even banned from the Washington State Convention for the Democratic Party at one point, because I wanted to be inside their meeting rooms and they wouldn't let me. But the question of, do you need a press pass to be a reporter? The answer is no. Although there are ways to get them, and there are ways to deal with that situation. The Independent Media Center in Seattle, we just created our own. Media groups for Occupy organizations can create their own DIY press badges. They're not necessarily passes, but that identify you as press or media are a good thing to have on you and may actually help you later if you are arrested and charged. There's also an organization called Demotix, Demotix. If you file, I think, 10 stories with them or something, and they don't even have to be stories that get published, but you can just send them 10 of your stories that haven't been published somewhere else. They will not only help shop those stories around for you to other alternative news agencies, but they will give you a press pass at some point after you've written enough articles for them, and that is an official press pass that can get you into events. Will police respect your press pass or your badges? Well, not necessarily. They don't seem to care, and they're especially biased and prejudiced towards what they consider to be activist journalists because they see us as just another protester. But that doesn't mean that you don't have the right to be there and that you can't fight that later, either through the courts or by suing them. A press badge and will not necessarily, especially a DIY press badge, will not necessarily get you into hotels or political events or conferences, because a lot of times those folks want background checks and accreditation, and you have to contact them ahead of time to even be considered to be allowed into their conference. I was able to push my way into a presentation by Attorney General Gonzalez, but they tried to stop me from getting in. It was the Discovery Institute, a very conservative think tank up here in Seattle. They tried to keep me from getting in, but the station manager actually called them and threatened to sue them for violation of the First Amendment, my freedom of the press. So they eventually let me in. However, as soon as I asked the Attorney General when he was going to resign, they immediately called the entire event, and the Secret Service basically grabbed him and took him out of the room. So I didn't get my question answered, but I did get in. Another question, I guess, is, can you be arrested for trespassing, and are you subject to physical removal and arrest at these events? Well, not if it's a public protest or march or rally, but yes, inside public property, inside of banks, inside of hotels, inside of private conferences and buildings, yes, you can be subject to that. And like I said, they can ban media from these events. So unless you infiltrate as non-media, you can't really get in. I actually did that for a group that was affiliated with the World Trade Organization in Tacoma. It was like a $1,500 a plate dinner, and I snuck my way in. But as soon as they found out that I was a journalist, after I kept asking inappropriate questions, I was banned from that place. So be your own news agency is my attitude, and believe me, with the technology we have today, it's not that hard to do. It's also easy to get free training if you volunteer for internships at public or college radio stations and community access TV. They can help you learn how to do audio and video editing. You don't need a supercomputer to do media work. MP3s don't really take that much memory. You can use an old computer. You can use freeware, shareware. Most reporting these days is done on MP3s. Interviews are easy to do on MP3, and you can immediately download them on a digital recorder as a file to your computer. If you use a mini disc recorder or other kinds of recording devices, then you're going to have to re-record it in real time into the audio software. But all of that is pretty self-explanatory after you've used it for the first few times. There's a big difference between interviews and news reports, and there's a big difference between headline news and feature news stories. And this is for all the folks in the Occupy media groups who are wondering how the news is scheduled and reported. Most headline news stories are, 20 seconds to a minute and a half at the most. So those are quick sound bites that usually just have a quick introduction by the reporter, maybe some field sound recording from the event, and maybe one quick quote from one of the participants. Then there are feature news stories where they usually like to have 2 to 3 voices. That means 2 to 3 people you've interviewed, or 2 to 3 quotes from people. And that can be a minute and 30 seconds up to like 5 minutes, depending on the format of the news program, because some news programs are 30 minutes or less, and some are an hour long, and some are just top of the news headline program. That's what most people hear on their local news station, is just the top of the news, 5 minutes of news. Most even alternative media will ask you to seek a voice from the opposition, although you can't always get people to do that. And I've had examples of that where I tried to get a statement from corporate, from Chase Bank about the bailouts. They say they don't have one. I tried to get a response from Starbucks about a protest at their shareholders meeting. I couldn't get one. I tried to get a response from the Pentagon about their indictments of journalists like myself who had interviewed Lieutenant Watada, the war resistor, and they of course wouldn't respond. So a lot of times the people you want to get, the opposition voice or the person that people are protesting against, you want to get their response to what's happening, but they may not want to talk to you. And especially if you're covering some kind of a court case, well, the plaintiffs and the defendants have been told on advice of their attorneys not to comment on the case until it goes to trial. So very seldom you're going to get them to talk unless it's at a quick press conference, or they're sitting next to their attorney, or their attorney is their spokesperson. And that's just because they don't want to give away information to the other side of the court case for their attorneys, so that they can one-up them or whatever. So don't be discouraged by that if you're a reporter, but don't ever badger people or insult someone for not talking to you, either whether you're a Occupy media group person or a journalist. Because just don't be Fox News, because people don't like that. They're mistrustful enough of the media as it is, and even as an alternative media journalist, a lot of times people who are putting on protests may not want you to be there or want to talk to you because they don't know who you are. They don't trust the media, and who knows, to them you could be an infiltrator, who knows. And to answer that question, yes, there are infiltrators in the media. There were memos that were disclosed, I think, through an FOIA request that showed that the CIA had mentioned that they had, quote, assets in the media. So wherever they're coming from, whether it's corporations or other unknown agencies, yes, there are plans in the media. Sometimes I wonder about that, if it explains how the corporate media in the United States has gone so far to the right. But before I wrap up here, I'd just like to say, it's really important that people understand that the definition of journalist is expanding, and there's a big gray area in 2012 about what is a reporter. Is it a Fox News reporter with a $500 suit and $300 haircut, or the kid on the skateboard with a cell phone camera who just caught video of a breaking news story? And the answer is both, although the corporate folks are definitely making themselves more irrelevant day by day to what's really happening in the community. The definition of reporter is definitely expanding due to technology. And if you're walking down the street and you happen to videotape a breaking story, you actually, by default, have become a stringer now for whatever news agency you want to take that audio or video to. Because if they don't have reporters available, or they weren't able to get there, they may want to buy it from you, or you can just give it to them if you think that it will help a cause or help uncover a story. So to be your own news agency, it's pretty easy to use Facebook, Twitter, sites to keep people updated, sometimes minute by minute on breaking news stories, because that's where journalism is today. It's down to the second when it comes to reporting. I mean, you can break a news story as it's happening, either through live streaming or just tweeting it or posting it on websites and Facebook. It's been helpful, I think, in the Occupy movement for people to post important events that they know about on other Occupy group websites and Facebook sites, because that's a quick way of getting the information out. And we've been really successful at getting in touch with the IT people for those websites that way. If they like the post, they might highlight it or ask you for more information and that kind of thing. So anybody can break a news story. It doesn't matter whether you have a professional job as a reporter or not. The technology involved is pretty actually simple to use these days, so it doesn't take a high-tech degree. In fact, everyone should know that in the media, even corporate media, the people who are hiring reporters and producers and writers are looking for people with experience that rates much more highly to them than a degree in journalism. You don't need a bachelor's degree in journalism to be a reporter and get paid by an agency to do the work. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for someone who's been on the air or who has written a lot of articles or who's been involved with a news group for a long time who knows what they're doing. Because that counts for much, much more when it comes to meeting those deadlines and being on the ground and doing the work. Otherwise, if you just have a degree, it could be all theoretical to you. You've never really used it. So the first time they put you on the air or stand you in front of a camera, you might just faint or something. So it can be difficult. So the tech stuff is easy to learn. We're still on. There's a lot of alternative media outlets to send your stuff to or to talk to about Occupy issues. I mean, you can go directly to the Associated Press, or you can go to Democracy Now! The Huffington Post is pretty open to this stuff. Counterpunch, Adbusters, Daily Kos. You can blog your own stuff there. Alternet, Common Dreams, Free Speech TV, and Free Speech Radio News. There's a lot of community and public stations around the country, from KBCS to KPFK, KPLA, WBAI in New York, KVLO in Portland. And there are foreign press agencies too, like Agence Presse France, the BBC, UK Guardian, Reuters, Al Jazeera. They're all looking for stories about the Occupy movement. And you've got your local community and alternative newspapers and magazines, and maybe even a few commercial progressive radio stations in your town, college student newspapers, all of these places. And actually, Webcast is another place to look for a way to get the information out. All of these places, if you do the research and try really hard to make contact, may actually be open to what you have to say and get your stuff out there. It's a personal contacts make all the difference.
You can't forget about Fire Dog Lake as well.
Yeah. And, okay, one more thing. I don't really want to talk about NPR because they're irrelevant at this point, but advice. If there's a big difference between speaking to the choir and speaking to the opposition, and we can all be respectful but very stubborn at the same time, and I like to say things to people who are trying to bait me, you know, hey, I just don't buy that, you know, I see a lot of evidence to the contrary, and then I go on with my point of view, so I don't necessarily respond directly to what they're saying, especially if it's insulting. But it's okay to disagree and still, you know, not resort to insults and shouting. But if you've been abused on the air, some talk show host or caller or producer is just insulting and trying to humiliate you, I suggest please hang up, because no one should have to allow themselves to be humiliated or degraded on the public airwaves. And you have the right to end an interview at any time, whether it's a reporter who's interviewing you or you're interviewing someone else who's being belligerent or offensive. So don't ever let them off the hook, you know, and always follow up with reporters and editors and find out who's in charge and keep feeding them information. Write to the reporters and thank them for covering an Occupy Wall Street movement event, because they never get thank yous and they'll remember that. And if you feel that they've been unfair in their coverage, definitely let them know and confront them directly through emails and phone calls. And I just, to end my presentation here, I think we may have actually turned a corporate Fox News reporter into an alternative media journalist by calling her on her news coverage, because later she told me that I was right and that she said, quote, I was on the wrong side, and all the people that she interviewed convinced her that the free trade agreements were really bad for the average person. And then she turned to me and asked me how she could contact alternative media outlets, and she told me she wanted to be an independent journalist. So,
that's so great, Mark. That's really wonderful. Thank you for that. We're coming up here. I don't mean to cut you up, but we're coming up here to the end of the hour, and I just wanted to open it up and make sure that people got a chance to ask questions if they wanted to, because I think you have a lot of really valuable information, and we always want to make sure that people get a chance to you know, pose questions. So if anybody has a question, can you raise your hand by pressing the button, I'll ask a question. Did you happen to live tweet any of your encounters with the police or live stream them?
It has happened on live stream because actually during General Assemblies at Westlake Park, police occasionally made sweeps through the park and even tried to arrest people sitting inside the crowd, inside the circle who were having a meeting. So yes, some of that has been live streamed, and in that case, between the live streamers and just the crowd chanting and locking arms around that person, it actually it fouled the arrest, and they didn't do it.
Yeah, that's my experience, that when I've live tweeted when I was being arrested, I think I live streamed my arrest, and I live tweeted when we were detained at Quantico over Bradley Manning, and WikiLeaks picked it up, and people all around the world were watching it, and the Department of Defense wound up having to call a press conference over it. That it's a really effective tool, and if people pick it up and they join in and they start watching it, it can create a lot of pressure on the people who are harassing you, which is why they're targeting journalists such as yourself. They know how powerful it is.
Yes, it's accountability. We're documenting what they're doing.
Yeah.
The issue that I didn't cover there is, what do you do if the police tell you to shut off your recording device or your camera?
Uh-huh.
And it's a really tricky issue. I believe you have the right to do it, and if you can conceal it and do it, even better. But I would say that if it is going to keep you from getting your head beaten or some other thing that you think is detrimental to yourself or other people, then do what Tim and Luke did in Chicago and just shut it off until you can turn it back on again. They did catch the beginning of the raid, and then were told to shut their stuff off. A lot of people are being told that, and police are threatening reporters with that. But a lot of the cases are upholding the reporter's right to record those things.
Huh.
And like in all of these,
that's a webinar in itself, right there. What to do if the police tell you to stop recording, and what your rights are and stuff. I think that would actually be great.
They're just hoping that you'll be intimidated.
We'll add that to the list.
Yeah.
They're just relying on intimidation at that point, like they do with activists all the time.